Access to the tomb was sometimes gained by a sloping passage or staircase. This made it possible to see if everything within was in a satisfactory condition. After the dead had been enclosed in his chamber, and 5 or 6 feet of sand had been spread over the beams which formed its roof, the position of the tomb was shown merely by a scarcely perceptible rise in the soil of the necropolis, and its site would soon have been forgotten, if its easternmost limits had not been marked by 2 large stelae, on which were carefully engraved one of the appellations of the king, that of his double, or his Horus name. It was on this spot, upon an altar placed between the 2 stelae, that the commemorative ceremonies were celebrated, and the provisions renewed on certain days fixed by the religious law. Groups of private tombs were scattered around, the resting places of the chief officers of the sovereign, the departed pharaoh being thus surrounded in death by the same courtiers as those who had attended him during his earthly existence. The princes, whose names and titles have been revealed to us by the inscriptions on these tombs, have not by any means been all classified as yet, the prevailing custom at that period having been to designate them by their Horus names, but rarely by their proper names, which latter is the only one which figures in the official list which we possess of the Egyptian kings. A few texts, more explicit than the rest, enable us to identify 3 of them with the Usiphaeus, the Miebes and the Senempsis of Manetho, the 5th, 6th, and 7th kings of the first dynasty. The fact that they are buried in the necropolis of Abydos apparently justifies the opinion of the Egyptian chroniclers that they were natives of Thinis. Is the Menes, who usually figures at their head, also a Thinite prince? Several scholars believe that his ordinary name, Mene, is to be read on an ivory tablet engraved for a sovereign whose Horus name, Ahuiti, the warlike, is known to us from several documents, and whose tomb also has been discovered, but at Nagada. It is a great rectangular structure of bricks 165 feet long and 84 broad, the external walls of which were originally ornamented by deep polygonal grooves, resembling those which score the facade of Chaldean buildings, but the Nagada tomb has a second brick wall which fills up all the hollows left in the first one, and thus hides the primitive decoration of the monument. The building contains 21 chambers, 5 of which in the centre apparently constituted the dwelling of the deceased, while the others, grouped around these, serve as storehouses from whence he could draw his provisions at will. Did the king buried within indeed bear the name of Menes, and if such was the case, how are we to reconcile the tradition of his Thinite origin with the existence of his far-off tomb in the neighbourhood of Thebes? Objects bearing his Horus name have been found at el-Gab, and it is evident that he belonged to the same age as the sovereigns interred in this necropolis. If indeed Menes was really his personal name, there is no reason against his being the Menes of tradition, he whom the pharaohs of the glorious Theban dynasties regarded as the earliest of their purely human ancestors. Whether he was really the first king who reigned over the whole of Egypt, or whether he had been preceded by other sovereigns whose monuments we may find in some sites still unexplored, is a matter for conjecture. That princes had exercised authority in various parts of the country is still uncertain, but that the Egyptian historians did not know them seems to prove that they had left no written records of their names. At any rate, a Menes lived who reigned at the outset of history, and doubtless before long the Nile Valley, when more carefully explored, will yield us monuments regarding his actions and determining his date. The civilization of the Egypt of his time was ruder than that which we have hitherto been familiar on its soil, but even at that early period it was almost as complete. It had its industries and its arts, of which the cemeteries furnish us daily with the most varied examples: weaving, modelling in clay, wood carving, the incising of ivory, gold, and the hardest stone were all carried on. The ground was cultivated with hoe and plough. Tombs were built showing us the model of what the houses and palaces must have been. The country had its army, its administrators, its priests, its nobles, its writing, and its system of epigraphy differs so little from that to which we are accustomed in later ages, that we can decipher it with no great difficulty. Frankly speaking, all that we know at present of the first of the pharaohs beyond the mere fact of his existence is practically nil, and the stories related of him by the writers of classical times are mere legends arranged to suit the fancy of the compiler. This Menes, according to the priests, surrounded Memphis with his dikes. for the river formerly followed the sandhills for some distance on the Libyan side. Menes, having dammed up the reach about 100 stadia to the south of Memphis, caused the old bed to dry up, and conveyed the river through an artificial channel dug midway between the two mountain ranges. Then Menes, the first who was a king, having enclosed a firm space of ground with dikes, there founded that town which is still called Memphis. He then made a lake around it, to the north and west, fed by the river, the city being bounded on the east by the Nile. The history of Memphis, such as it can be gathered from the monuments, differs considerably from the tradition current in Egypt at the time of Herodotus. It appears, indeed, that at the outset, the site on which it subsequently arose was occupied by a small fortress, Anbu Hazu, the White Wall, which was dependent on Heliopolis, and in which Ptah possessed a sanctuary. After the White Wall was separated from the Heliopolitan Principality to form a nome by itself, it assumed a certain importance, and furnished, so it was said, the dynasties which succeeded the Thinite. Its prosperity dates only, however, from the time when the sovereigns of the 5th and 6th dynasties fixed on it for their residence. One of them, Papi I, there founded for himself and for his double after him a new town, which he called Minofiru, from his tomb. Minofiru, which is the correct pronunciation and the origin of Memphis, probably signified the good refuge, the haven of the good, the burying place where the blessed dead came to rest beside Osiris. The people soon forgot the true interpretation, or probably it did not fall within their taste for romantic tales. They were rather disposed, as a rule, to discover in the beginnings of history individuals from whom the countries or cities in which they were familiar took their names. If no tradition supplied them with this, they did not experience any scruple in inventing one. Egyptians of the time of the Ptolemies, who were guided in their philological speculations by the pronunciation in vogue around them, attributed the patronship of their city to a princess Memphis, a daughter of its founder, the fabulous Uchareus. Those of preceding ages, before the name had become altered, thought to find in Minofiru a mini Nofir, or Menes the Good, the reputed founder of the capital of the Delta. Menes the Good, divested of his epithet, is none other than Menes, the first king, and he owes this episode in his life to a popular attempt at etymology. The legend which identifies the establishment of the kingdom with the construction of the city must have originated at a time when Memphis was still the residence of the kings and the seat of government, at latest about the end of the Memphite period. It must have been an old tradition in the time of the Theban dynasties, since they admitted unhesitatingly the authenticity of the statements, which ascribed to the northern city so marked a superiority over their own country. When once this half-mythical Menes was firmly established in his position, there was little difficulty in inventing a story which would portray him as an ideal sovereign. He was represented as architect, warrior, and statesman. He had begun the temple of Ptah, written laws and regulated the worship of the gods, particularly that of Hapis, and he had conducted expeditions against the Libyans. When he lost his only son in the flower of his age, the people improvised a hymn of mourning to console him, the Mineros, both the words and the tune of which were handed down from generation to generation. He did not, moreover, disdain the luxuries of the table, for he invented the art of serving a dinner, and the mode of eating it in a reclining posture. One day, while hunting, his dogs, excited by something or other, fell upon him to devour him. He escaped with difficulty, and, pursued by them, fled to the shore of Lake Moeris, and was there brought to bay. He was on the point of succumbing to them, when a crocodile took him on his back and carried him across to the other side. In gratitude he built a new town, which he called Crocodilopolis, and assigned to it for its god the crocodile which had saved him. He then erected close to it the famous labyrinth and a pyramid for his tomb. Other traditions show him in a less favourable light. They accuse him of having, by horrible crimes, excited against him the anger of the gods, and allege that after a reign of 60 to 62 years, he was killed by a hippopotamus which came forth from the Nile. They also related that the Sayyid Tafnakhti, returning from an expedition against the Arabs, during which he had been obliged to renounce the pomp and luxuries of royal life, had solemnly cursed him, and had caused his imprecations to be inscribed upon a stele set up in the temple of Ammon at Thebes. Nevertheless, in the memory that Egypt preserved of its first pharaoh, the good outweighed the evil. He was worshipped in Memphis side by side with Ptah and Ramses II. His name figured at the head of the royal lists, and his cult continued till the time of the Ptolemies. His immediate successors had an actual existence, and their tombs are there in proof of it. We know where Eusebius, Miebes, and Semempsis were laid to rest, besides more than a dozen other princes whose real names and whose position in the official list are still uncertain. The order of their succession was often a matter of doubt to the Egyptians themselves, but perhaps the discoveries of the next few years will enable us to clear up and settle definitely matters which were shrouded in mystery in the time of the Theban pharaohs. As a fact, the forms of such of their names as have been handed down to us by later tradition are curt and rugged, indicative of an early state of society, and harmonizing with the more primitive civilization to which they belong. Ati the wrestler, Teti the runner, Quenkani the crusher, are suitable rulers for a people, the first duty of whose chief was to lead his followers into battle, and to strike harder than any other man in the thickest of the fight. End of section 27. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 12. Some of the monuments they have left us seem to show that their reigns were as much devoted to war as those of later pharaohs. The king whose Horus name was Neromir is seen on a contemporary object which has come down to us, standing before a heap of beheaded foes. The bodies are all stretched out on the ground, each with his head placed neatly between his legs. The king had overcome, apparently in some important engagement, several thousand of his enemies, and was inspecting the execution of their leaders. That the foes with whom these early kings contended were in most cases Egyptian princes of the nomes is proved by the list of city names which are inscribed on the fragments of other documents of the same nature, and we gather from them that Dobu, Edfu, Hazutonu, Sinopolis, Habanu, Hipponon, Hakau, Memphis, and others were successfully taken and dismantled. On this fragment, King Den is represented standing over a prostrate chief of the Bedouin, striking him with his mace. Sondi, who is classed in the second dynasty, received a continuous worship towards the end of the third dynasty. But did all those whose names preceded or followed his on the lists really exist as he did? And if they existed, to what extent do the order and the relation assigned to them agree with the actual truth? The different lists do not contain the same names in the same positions. Certain pharaohs are added or suppressed without appreciable reason. Where Manetho inscribes Kenkenes and Unephes, the tables of the time of Seti I give us Ati and Ata. Manetho reckons 9 kings to the second dynasty, while they register only 5. The monuments indeed show us that Egypt in the past obeyed princes whom her annalists were unable to classify. For instance, they associate with Sondi a Pirsenu, who is not mentioned in the annals. We must therefore take the record of all this opening period of history for what it is, namely, a system invented at a much later date, by means of various artifices and combinations, to be partially accepted in default of a better, but without according to it that excessive confidence which it has hitherto received. The 2 Thinite dynasties, in direct descent from the first human king Menes, furnish, like this hero himself, only a tissue of romantic tales and miraculous legends in the place of history. A double-headed stork, which had appeared in the first year of Teti, son of Menes, had foreshadowed to Egypt a long prosperity, but a famine under Onefis and a terrible plague under Senempsis had depopulated the country. The laws had been relaxed, great crimes had been committed, and revolts had broken out. During the reign of Bothos, a gulf had opened near Bubastis, and swallowed up many people. Then the Nile had flowed with honey for 15 days in the time of Neferkheres, and Sesostris was supposed to have been a giant in stature. A few details about royal edifices were mixed up with these prodigies. Teti had laid the foundation of the great palace of Memphis. Onefes had built the pyramids of Kokeme near Saqqara. Several of the ancient pharaohs had published books on theology, or had written treatises on anatomy and medicine. Several had made laws which lasted down to the beginning of the Christian era. One of them was called Kaku, the male of males, or the bull of bulls. They explained his name by the statement that he had concerned himself about the sacred animals. He had proclaimed as gods Hapis of Memphis, Menevis of Heliopolis, and the goat of Mendes. After him, Binothrus had conferred the right of succession upon all the women of the blood royal. The accession of the third dynasty, a Memphite one according to Manetho, did not at first change the miraculous character of this history. The Libyans had revolted against Necher-Aphes, and the two armies were encamped before each other, when one night the disk of the moon became immeasurably enlarged, to the great alarm of the rebels, who recognized in this phenomenon a sign of the anger of heaven, and yielded without fighting. Tosorthros, the successor of Necher-Aphes, brought the hieroglyphs and the art of stone cutting to perfection. He composed, as Teti did, books of medicine, a fact which caused him to be identified with the healing god Imhotpu. The priests related these things seriously, and the Greek writers took them down from their lips with the respect which they offered to everything emanating from the wise men of Egypt. What they related of the human kings was not more detailed, as we see, than their accounts of the gods. Whether the legends dealt with deities or kings, all that we know took its origin, not in popular imagination, but in sacerdotal dogma. They were invented long after the times they dealt with, in the recesses of the temples, with an intention and a method of which we are enabled to detect flagrant instances on the monuments. Towards the middle of the 3rd century before our era, the Greek troops stationed on the southern frontier, in the forts at the First Cataract, developed a particular veneration for Isis of Philae. Their devotion spread to the superior officers who came to inspect them, then to the whole population of the Thebaid, and finally reached the court of the Macedonian kings. The latter, carried away by force of example, gave every encouragement to a movement which attracted worshippers to a common sanctuary, and united in one cult the two races over which they ruled. They pulled down the meagre building of the Saite period which had hitherto sufficed for the worship of Isis, constructed at great cost the temple which still remains almost intact, and assigned to it considerable possessions in Nubia, which, in addition to gifts from private individuals, made the goddess the richest landowner in southern Egypt. Khnummu and his two wives, Anukit and Satit, who before Isis had been the undisputed suzerains of the cataract, perceived with jealousy their neighbours' prosperity. The civil wars and invasions of the centuries immediately preceding had ruined their temples, and their poverty contrasted painfully with the riches of the newcomer. The priests resolved to lay this sad state of affairs before King Ptolemy, to represent to him the services which they had rendered and still continued to render to Egypt, and above all to remind him of the generosity of the ancient pharaohs, whose example, owing to the poverty of the times, the recent pharaohs had been unable to follow. Doubtless authentic documents were wanting in their archives to support their pretensions. They therefore inscribed upon a rock, in the island of Sahel, a long inscription which they attributed to Zosiri of the 3rd dynasty. This sovereign had left behind him a vague reputation for greatness. As early as the 12th dynasty, Usirtasen III had claimed him as his father, his ancestor, and had erected a statue to him. The priests knew that, by invoking him, they had a chance of obtaining a hearing. The inscription which they fabricated set forth that in the 18th year of Zosiri's reign he had sent to Madir, lord of Elephantine, a message couched in these terms: "I am overcome with sorrow for the throne, and for those who reside in the palace, and my heart is afflicted and suffers greatly because the Nile has not risen in my time, for the space of 8 years. Corn is scarce, there is a lack of herbage, and nothing is left to eat. When anyone calls upon his neighbours for help, they take pains not to go. The child weeps, the young man is uneasy, the hearts of the old men are in despair, their limbs are bent." Did the Ptolemies admit the claims which the local priests attempted to deduce from this romantic tale? And did the god regain possession of the domains and dues which they declared had been his right? The stele shows us with what ease the scribes could forge official documents. When the exigencies require, they crouch on the earth, they fold their hands, the courtiers have no further resources, the shops formerly furnished with rich wares are now only filled with air, all that was in them has disappeared. My spirit also, mindful of the beginning of things, seeks to call upon the Saviour who was here where I am, during the centuries of the gods, upon Thot Ibis, that great wise one, upon Imhotpu, son of Ptah of Memphis. Where is the place in which the Nile is born? Who is the god or goddess concealed there? What is his likeness? The lord of Elephantine brought his reply in person. He described to the king, who was evidently ignorant of it, the situation of the island and the rocks of the cataract, the phenomena of the inundation, the gods who presided over it, and who alone could relieve Egypt from her disastrous plight. So Siri repaired to the temple of the principality and offered the prescribed sacrifices. The god arose, opened his eyes, panted, and cried aloud, "I am Khnummu who created thee," and promised him a speedy return of a high Nile and the cessation of the famine. Pharaoh was touched by the benevolence which his divine father had shown him. He forthwith made a decree by which he ceded to the temple all his rights of suzerainty over the neighbouring nomes within a radius of 20 miles. Henceforward the entire population, tillers and vine-dressers, fishermen and hunters, had to yield the tithes of their incomes to the priests. The quarries could not be worked without the consent of Khnummu, and the payment of a suitable indemnity into his coffers, and finally all metals and precious woods shipped thence for Egypt had to submit to a toll on behalf of the temple. Though the daily life forced the necessity upon them, it teaches us at the same time how that fabulous chronicle was elaborated, whose remains have been preserved for us by classical writers. Every prodigy, every fact related by Manetho, was taken from some document analogous to the supposed inscription of Zosiri. The real history of the early centuries, therefore, eludes our researches, and no contemporary record traces for us those vicissitudes which Egypt passed through before being consolidated into a single kingdom, under the rule of one man. Many names, apparently of powerful and illustrious princes, had survived in the memory of the people. These were collected, classified, and grouped in a regular manner into dynasties, but the people were ignorant of any exact facts connected with the names, and the histories, on their own account, were reduced to collect apocryphal traditions for their sacred archives. The monuments of these remote ages, however, cannot have entirely disappeared. They exist in places where we have not as yet thought of applying the pick, and chance excavations will some day most certainly bring them to light. The few which we do possess barely go back beyond the third dynasty, namely, the hypogeum of Shiri, priest of Sondi and of Pirsenu, possibly the tomb of Quit-Thotpu at Saqqara, the great Sphinx of Giza, a short inscription on the rocks of the Wadi Maghara, which represents Zosiri, the same king of whom the priests of Khnummu in the Greek period made a precedent, working the turquoise or copper mines of Sinai, and finally the step pyramid where this same pharaoh rests. It forms a rectangular mass, incorrectly oriented, with a variation from the true north of 4 degrees 35 minutes, 393 feet 8 inches long from east to west, and 352 feet deep, with a height of 159 feet 9 inches. It is composed of 6 cubes, with sloping sides, each being about 13 feet less in width than the one below it. That nearest to the ground measures 37 feet 8 inches in height, and the uppermost one 29 feet 9 inches. It was entirely constructed of limestone from the neighbouring mountains. The blocks are small and badly cut, the stone courses being concave to offer a better resistance to downward thrust and to shocks of earthquake. When breaches in the masonry are examined, it can be seen that the external surface of the steps has, as it were, a double stone facing, each facing being carefully dressed. The body of the pyramid is solid, the chambers being cut in the rock beneath. These chambers have been often enlarged, restored, and reworked in the course of centuries, and the passages which connect them form a perfect labyrinth into which it is dangerous to venture without a guide. The columned porch, the galleries and halls, all lead to a sort of enormous shaft, at the bottom of which the architect had contrived a hiding place, destined, no doubt, to contain the more precious objects of the funerary furniture. Until the beginning of this century, the vault had preserved its original lining of glazed pottery. 3/4 of the wall surface were covered with green tiles, oblong and slightly convex on the outer side, but flat on the inner. A square projection pierced with a hole served to fix them at the back in a horizontal line by means of flexible wooden rods. The 3 bands which frame one of the doors are inscribed with the titles of the pharaohs. The hieroglyphs are raised in either blue, red, green, or yellow, on a fawn-coloured ground. Other kings had built temples, palaces, and towns, as, for instance, King Kasakimu, of whose construction some traces exist at Heracleopolis, opposite to El Kab, or King Kasak Mui, who preceded by a few years the pharaohs of the fourth dynasty, but the monuments which they raised to be witnesses of their power or piety to future generations have in the course of ages disappeared under the tramplings and before the triumphal blasts of many invading hosts. The pyramid alone has survived, and the most ancient of the historic monuments of Egypt is a tomb. End of Chapter 3. End of Volume 1 of the History of Egypt by Gaston Maspero.